Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're diving deep into the heart of the African diaspora in the New World. And let me tell you, we're going to a place you might not expect. So let's start with a question, one that might just flip what you think you know about the history of slavery in the Americas. Around the year 1800, where was its true center? Where did the vast majority of enslaved Africans end up? If you're thinking the United States, well, get ready for a shock. The reality is, a staggering 10 times as many enslaved Africans were brought to Spanish and Portuguese America than to the United States. We're talking about 5.7 million people versus about 560,000. I mean, that's not just a small correction. That completely reorients the entire story. What that means is, to really truly understand the African diaspora, we have to shift our focus. We have to look south, to a world that was just so much more complex than the single story of slavery we often hear about in North America. And to get a feel for this complexity, just listen to what a British clergyman, Robert Walsh, saw on his very first day in Rio de Janeiro back in 1828. First, he saw enslaved laborers on the docks, exhausted, coiled up like dogs. But then, just moments later, he sees this incredibly disciplined black militia regiment marching by. Then he meets these really respectable black men and women working as independent street vendors. And to top it all off, that afternoon, he witnesses a black Catholic priest conducting a funeral. Think about that. In a single day, slaves, soldiers, entrepreneurs, and priests. That was the multifaceted world of Afro-Latin America. So, how on earth did a society like this even come to exist? Well, first you've got to understand the absolutely brutal economic machine that drove this whole massive forced migration. And this machine, it was all fueled by producing commodities for Europe. It was centered in these export-focused colonies you see here, the sugar, coffee, and gold regions of Brazil, the Caribbean coasts of places like Colombia and Venezuela, and, by 1800, the booming sugar islands of Cuba and Puerto Rico. These were the heartlands. Now, the system ran on a horrifyingly unsustainable model. It's called a vicious demographic circle. The conditions on the plantations were so brutal, infant mortality was so high, and there was such a severe gender imbalance among the people brought from Africa that the enslaved population just couldn't naturally reproduce itself. And what did that lead to? A constant, desperate demand for more people to be captured and brought from Africa, which of course just fed this deadly cycle. It was a grinding, relentless chain of suffering. And you can see right here just how much that terrible cycle intensified after 1750. You had economic reforms and the Haitian Revolution, which basically knocked out the world's top sugar producer, and that created this massive boom for Brazil and the Spanish colonies. I mean, the numbers on this chart tell the whole story. Annual slave imports to Brazil just skyrocketed, and in Cuba, they increased sevenfold. More Africans were arriving than ever before, all to feed this expanding machine. And this is so important, against this oppressive machine, enslaved people waged a constant and incredibly creative struggle. And this wasn't just about big, violent rebellions. It was a whole repertoire of tactics, all aimed at gaining some dignity and some control over their own lives. This timeline shows one of the most remarkable examples, the copper miners of Santiago del Prado in Cuba. For more than a century, these cobreros fought for their freedom using every single tool they had. We're talking legal petitions, strikes, escaping into the forests, even sending representatives all the way to Spain to plead their case directly to the king. And can you believe it? In 1801, after generations of struggle, they won. They gained not just their freedom, but collective ownership of their land. Now, the Cobrero story is absolutely epic, but that same spirit of negotiation was happening every single day on plantations all over. Enslaved people, they knew their value. They knew exactly how to slow down production or use their skills to speed it up. And they used this knowledge as leverage, as a bargaining chip, to get concessions, a little extra food, some time to tend their own gardens, better work conditions, and sometimes even a promise of freedom. And sometimes, those negotiations would just boil over into full-blown strikes. And if you look at the demands from two different uprisings, you really see what was at stake. On the Santa Ana plantation in Brazil, the strikers demanded control over the work itself. They wanted fixed quotas and even the right to approve their own overseers. But over at the Mompox Hacienda in Colombia, the demands were for time off, better food, and access to a priest. When you put them together, you see what this was all about. Control over your work, your time, your food, and your family. And family?
family was the absolute bedrock. This heartbreaking quote from Juan Francisco Manzano, an Afro-Cuban author born into slavery, it just shows you how central family was. He's talking about his mother here. You see, family wasn't just crucial emotional support, it was also an economic strategy. Relatives would pool their tiny earnings for years, sometimes for decades, just to buy the freedom of one family member at a time.
And we have to remember that resistance was also cultural. When those Santana strikers demanded the right to play, relax, and sing, that was a profound statement of their humanity. You can really feel it in these images. Music and dance, they weren't just distractions. They were a form of healing, a way to build community, and a space where African spiritual life could continue to breathe. Okay, so let's zoom out and see how all of this constant pressure from below didn't just chip away at slavery. It actually started to forge an entirely new society right from within the old one. This quote from a Brazilian governor, wow, it just lays bare the deepest fear of the colonial authorities. He's basically admitting that the only thing keeping the whole system from collapsing was division between different African ethnic groups. He knew that if they ever united, it would be an enormous and inevitable danger that would desolate Brazil. And the ultimate form of resistance, the ultimate expression of that unity, was flight. Runaways created their own independent communities. They were known as quilombos in Brazil and palenques in Spanish America. And these weren't just little hideouts. They were free societies, carved right out of the wilderness. The most famous of them all was Palmeiras in Brazil. And listen, this was no small village. We're talking about a federation of settlements with up to 15,000 people, organized with West African political structures. It was literally a kingdom of runaways that successfully fought off Portuguese military expeditions for nearly 100 years. What a powerful symbol of freedom. And all of this struggle, from lawsuits and daily negotiations to flight and open rebellion, it all had a huge cumulative effect. This chart shows the surprising result. By 1800, in most of Spanish and Portuguese America, the free Black and mulatto population was actually larger than the enslaved population. That's a reality completely different from what was happening in British North America. So all this history, it leaves us with a final, really powerful thought. Long before the abolitionist movements many of us learn about, Afro-Latin Americans were already winning their freedom, building their own communities, and forcing a rigid colonial world to change. And that legacy, it didn't end when slavery was abolished. So the real question for us is, how does that centuries-long struggle for dignity and freedom continue to shape the Americas today?